Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. End of part 1. Mark sat in his small apartment, the sound of the rain outside tapping against the window, matching the beat of his thoughts. His fingers traced the edge of the coffee mug, the weight of Eleanor's offer still lingering in his mind. It was an absurd proposal, yet part of him couldn't shake the idea. His mother's medical bills were piling up, and his sister's tuition fees loomed just around the corner. He had been fighting to stay afloat for so long, and now, this impossible chance was his only real shot. He exhaled deeply, looking down at his phone, the email from Eleanor still open on the screen. The offer hadn't changed. She hadn't given him a choice. Marry her, and his financial problems would disappear. It was simple, really, but nothing about it felt simple. Mark's thoughts drifted back to the cafe meeting. He could still see Eleanor's piercing blue eyes, the way she had looked at him with such confidence, like she already knew the answer before he could say a word. He felt small next to her, like a boy trying to play in a grown-up world. But that world was one he could never enter without her help. He ran his hand through his hair, his gaze falling to the crumpled papers on his desk, the overdue bills, the final notice on the rent. All of it was weighing on him, pulling him deeper into a hole he didn't know how to climb out of. He couldn't deny that the offer seemed like a lifeline, even though it came with strings attached. A marriage, arranged like a business deal, with no love involved. But Eleanor had been clear about one thing: she didn't need love. She needed a companion, someone to stand by her, someone to help her keep up appearances, someone who could be her husband in public. In return, she would take care of everything. For a moment, Mark imagined what it would be like to wake up without the crushing weight of debt on his shoulders, without the constant fear of losing everything. It wasn't just about the money though.
There's a part of him, something deep inside, that knew this was more than just a financial transaction. Eleanor's proposition wasn't just a business deal. It was an escape, a chance to step into a world he never thought possible. But what cost? A marriage without love, a life built on a lie. Mark didn't know if he could live with that. The more he thought about it, the more the lines blurred. He needed the money, he needed the stability, but he also knew that agreeing to this would change everything. He would have to play a role, pretend to be someone he wasn't. And for how long? A year? 2? What if he found himself stuck, living a life that wasn't his own, bound by a contract that forced him to hide his true self? And what if he fell in love with her? Or worse, what if she fell in love with him? The complications seemed endless. Mark's phone buzzed, snapping him back to reality. He glanced at the screen, seeing the familiar name. It was his mother, calling from the hospital. Mark sighed, wiping his face with his hand before answering. "Hey, Mom," he said, trying to keep the tremor out of his voice. "Mark, sweetheart, I just want to check in. I know you're busy, but I'm really starting to worry about these bills. I don't want you to feel like you have to do this all on your own." His mother's voice came through, gentle but filled with concern. Mark felt a lump form in his throat. "I'm doing the best I can, Mom. Don't worry, okay? Everything will be fine." He knew he was lying. Everything wasn't fine. It hadn't been for a long time. His mother was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I know you're trying, Mark. I just don't want you to sacrifice yourself for me. You've already been through so much." Mark felt a pang in his chest. "I'll figure it out, Mom. Don't worry about me." He hung up the phone and sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of her words sinking in. He wanted to protect her, to take away all the stress. But how could he when he couldn't even protect himself? His mind drifted back to Eleanor's offer, the promise of a better life. All he had to do was say yes. Marry her. Play his part. Keep up the charade. And in return, everything would be taken care of. But could he really do it? Could he live a life of lies, all for the sake of security?
Eleanor had offered him a way out, but it was a way he wasn't sure he was ready to take. Mark's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Eleanor. I hope you've had some time to think, Mark. Let me know your decision. Time is running out. He stared at the message for a long moment, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to decide. Was he ready to make the hardest choice of his life? With a deep breath, he typed his reply. I'll do it. End of part 2. Mark sat back in his chair, staring at the phone in his hand, the message from Eleanor still lingering on the screen. He had said yes. It was done. The decision had been made, and he was now tied to her in a way he couldn't fully comprehend. He had promised himself that he would figure out the details later, but now, in the quiet of his small apartment, reality started to settle in. This wasn't just about money or debts anymore. This was about a life that he would have to live pretending to be something he wasn't. Pretending to be someone he could never truly be. He exhaled sharply, running his fingers through his hair. It wasn't supposed to feel like this. He was supposed to feel relieved. Grateful, even. He had made the decision, after all, to secure his family's future. But instead, all he felt was a sinking weight in his chest. Eleanor was a woman of power, wealth, and control. She didn't need a husband for love. She needed someone to stand by her side, to play the role of a partner in a world that demanded appearances. And that was what he was going to do. Play a role. The next day, Mark stood in front of Eleanor's office building, the towering glass structure looming over him like a monument to everything he couldn't touch. He had never been inside a place like this, never even dreamed of walking through these doors. But now, he was about to sign his life away. Or at least, the part of it that mattered. The part that kept him bound to his family's struggles and his own pride. He stepped through the revolving doors, his heart pounding in his chest. The receptionist gave him a polite smile as she directed him to the elevator. Eleanor was waiting for him on the top floor. Mark tried to steady his breathing, but his nerves were getting the best of him. This was it. The moment that would change everything. The elevator doors opened, and Mark stepped out into a sleek, modern lobby.
Eleanor was already standing there, her back straight and her posture impeccable. She wore a tailored suit, the kind that only someone with her wealth and status could pull off effortlessly. Her eyes met his, and she gave him a small nod. "Mark," she said, her voice as calm and confident as it had been during their first meeting. "I'm glad you came." He nodded, though his throat was tight, making it hard to speak. "Yeah, I'm here." She gestured for him to follow her down the hall. The walls were lined with expensive artwork, the kind of pieces that Mark had only seen in magazines. As they walked, Eleanor spoke casually, telling him about the various events they would need to attend, the image they needed to maintain, the role he would play. Mark listened quietly, trying to absorb it all. His mind was reeling, but he couldn't afford to hesitate now. They reached a large conference room, and Eleanor opened the door. Inside, a few of her assistants were already gathered, working on various papers and laptops. They all looked up as she entered, and she gave them a brief, professional smile. "This is Mark Davis," she said, introducing him to the room. "He'll be playing the part of my husband, effective immediately." The way she said it made it sound almost effortless, as if this was nothing more than another business transaction. And in many ways, Mark realized that was all it was. The assistants exchanged glances but said nothing. Eleanor's authority was clear, and no one questioned her decisions. Mark felt a strange sense of detachment as he stood there, not quite believing that this was really happening. He had gone from being a struggling law student to playing the part of a husband in a deal that could change everything. "I'll have the papers ready for you to sign shortly," Eleanor said, her voice cutting through his thoughts. "But first, there's something I want you to understand." Mark looked up at her, his mind already racing ahead, thinking of the next steps, the next thing he would need to do. But Eleanor's gaze softened just slightly as she spoke again. "This isn't just about what's on paper," she said, her voice lower now, almost thoughtful. "This is about keeping everything running smoothly. My reputation, my business, everything I've worked for depends on this."
"I need someone who will stand by me, who will help me navigate the world I'm in." Mark swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I get it," he said, his voice almost a whisper. I'm here to play the part. Eleanor's eyes met his, and for the first time, Mark saw a flicker of something behind her composed exterior. Good, she said simply. Because this isn't just about us. This is about everything we stand to gain, and everything we could lose. Mark nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what he had just signed up for. The weight of the contract was heavy, but the weight of the promise he had made to his family was heavier. He had no choice but to go through with it. But as Eleanor handed him the papers, he couldn't help but wonder, was he really prepared to live a life where everything was just a performance? He signed the papers, and with that simple gesture, everything changed. His future, his identity, his relationships, all of it would be shaped by this one decision. And there was no going back. End of part 3. The morning of the ceremony arrived with a strange stillness in the air. Mark stood in front of the mirror in a perfectly tailored black suit that fit him better than anything he had ever owned. The reflection staring back at him looked like a stranger, confident, composed, even handsome, but inside, his heart was pounding. In just a few hours, he would be married to Eleanor Brooks, the woman who had offered him the strangest deal of his life. It was not love. It was not even friendship. It was a contract. A business arrangement that would change everything. He adjusted his tie, his hands trembling slightly, then drew a long breath. You can do this, he whispered to himself. You have to. At precisely 11 o'clock, a sleek black car arrived to pick him up. The driver, dressed in a formal uniform, opened the door with quiet precision. The city moved past in a blur as they drove toward the courthouse. The world outside was normal, people walking dogs, couples laughing over coffee, and for a moment, Mark wished he could trade places with any of them. But that kind of life was not his anymore. Not after today. When they reached the courthouse, Eleanor was already there, waiting at the steps. She was dressed in a soft ivory suit, elegant and commanding, her silver hair perfectly styled. She turned as he approached, her expression calm but unreadable.
You look nervous, she said lightly, her tone almost teasing. Mark gave a faint, awkward smile. I have never done this before. Eleanor's lips curved into the smallest hint of a smile. Neither have I. What is only paperwork, Mark? Nothing more. Her words were steady, but her eyes flickered for a brief moment, something fragile beneath the surface confidence. Before he could respond, the officiant called him inside. The ceremony was small, quiet, and efficient. Just a notary, Eleanor's lawyer, and a clerk to witness the signing. No flowers, no vows, no family. When the clerk asked them to exchange rings, Eleanor produced 2 simple gold bands. She slid his onto his finger without hesitation, and he followed suit, his hands cold. When it was done, the clerk smiled politely. Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Brooks. The words hit Mark harder than he expected. Mrs. Brooks. For the first time, it sounded final. As they left the courthouse, a light drizzle began to fall. Eleanor stepped into the waiting car, and Mark followed silently. The ride back to her estate was long and quiet, the tension thick enough to feel. When they arrived, Mark stared at the mansion from the car window, unable to believe it was real. The Brooks estate was enormous, a sprawling white mansion, surrounded by manicured gardens and iron gates that gleamed under the rain. He had seen places like this only in magazines. The car stopped at the grand entrance, and Eleanor turned to him. Welcome home, Mr. Davis, she said softly, a faint note of irony in her tone. Inside, the house was breathtaking. Marble floors, tall windows, chandeliers that glittered like falling stars. Every corner whispered wealth and legacy. A maid guided him to a guest suite that looked larger than his entire apartment. The room smelled faintly of lavender and wood polish, with silk curtains and a view of the gardens below. Yet for all its beauty, it felt cold, too perfect, too untouched. He set a small suitcase on the bed, feeling completely out of place. Later that evening, a housekeeper knocked and informed him that dinner would be served at 7. Mark nodded, thanked her quietly, and changed into the clothes Eleanor's assistant had delivered earlier, a dark suit that felt heavy on his shoulders. When he walked into the dining room, Eleanor was already there, seated at the far end of a long mahogany table.
The meal looked exquisite: steak, roasted vegetables, a bottle of red wine breathing on the table. Mark hesitated before sitting down. The silence between them stretched until Eleanor finally spoke. "You do not have to look so uncomfortable. This is your home now." He managed a weak smile. "It does not feel like it yet." She tilted her head slightly. "It will. Eventually." For a while, they ate in silence. Mark noticed how deliberate she was, every movement, every word measured. There was an aura of control about her, but beneath it, he caught glimpses of something else: loneliness, maybe, or exhaustion. After dinner, she pushed her plate aside and looked at him. "I imagine this is all very strange for you," she said. "It is not exactly how most people start their lives together." Mark let out a quiet laugh. "That is one way to put it." Eleanor leaned back slightly, studying him. "I know what people will think when they see us together. They will think I am desperate. Or that you are after my money. They always do. But as long as we know the truth, it does not matter." He looked at her, curious. "And what is the truth?" For a moment, she held his gaze. "The truth is, Mark, we both needed something the other could give. You needed a way out. I needed someone to stand beside me. That is all this is." Her tone was firm, but there was something almost fragile in the way she said it. Mark nodded slowly. "I understand." But as the night went on and he retreated to his room, her words echoed in his mind. He lay on the edge of the enormous bed, staring up at the ornate ceiling. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the rain still falling against the windows. Everything he had ever known felt far away now: his mother's small kitchen, the sound of his sister's laughter, the cluttered apartment he once called home. He had traded it all for this quiet, luxurious prison. And even though he had made the choice willingly, he could not help but wonder if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. End of part 4. The days that followed felt like a blur to Mark. Eleanor had kept their arrangement clear and professional. They attended meetings, social events, and charity galas, always side by side, always as if nothing more existed between them than the title of husband and wife. Mark played his part, but the more he did, the more he realized how much he had changed.
He was no longer the young law student struggling to pay rent. Now he walked into rooms filled with high-powered people, sat at tables with CEOs, and felt out of place with every passing moment. Eleanor had given him everything: security, a lavish lifestyle, the chance to breathe without the constant pressure of bills piling up. But in return, he had lost something important: his sense of self. One evening, after another gala they had attended together, Eleanor invited Mark to her office. He had been working on some paperwork in his room when he received her message. When he entered, she was standing by the window, her back to him, looking out over the city. The city lights flickered below, casting a soft glow over her figure. She didn't turn when he walked in, but instead spoke in a low voice. "Mark, there is something we need to discuss." Mark paused, sensing the change in her tone. For weeks now, they had kept everything formal, but there was something about the way she spoke now that made him uneasy. He stood by the door, his hands in his pockets, waiting for her to continue. She turned slowly, her face unreadable. "I know this arrangement is unconventional," she said, her voice steady. But Mark could see the hint of something more behind her eyes. "But it's working, isn't it? You've been playing the role well, and I've kept my end of the deal." She looked at him closely. "But there is one thing I need to be sure of, phone thing I can't let slide." Mark swallowed, feeling his heart race. "What do you mean?" Eleanor stepped forward, her gaze locked onto his. "You said yes to this agreement because you needed something. But I need to know, Mark, do you still believe that? Do you still believe in this arrangement? Or has something changed?" She studied him carefully, waiting for his answer. Mark opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He had promised himself that he would never get too attached to this life, that he would stick to the deal, to the contract. But the longer he stayed in this mansion, the longer he lived this lie, the more it felt like he was losing himself. He thought about the times he had found himself laughing with Eleanor at a gala, or the late-night conversations they had shared in her office about their pasts. He had always kept his distance, reminding himself that this was just business. But was it?
He glanced at her, searching for some sign that she understood. I never expected things to get complicated, he said quietly. But they have. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. Complicated? Mark hesitated for a moment before speaking. I don't know when it happened, but somewhere along the way, it stopped feeling like just a business arrangement. I started thinking of you as more than just my boss. More than just the woman I'm supposed to stand next to at events. I started to care. Eleanor's face softened slightly, but she quickly masked it. Mark, that's the last thing you need to be concerned about. Her voice was firm, but there was an edge to it now. We made a deal. A clear deal. We both agreed to it. And it works because we don't complicate things. Mark clenched his fists, his mind racing. Was he truly just another pawn in this game of hers? He had been so focused on surviving, on getting out of the financial mess he had been in, that he hadn't stopped to consider what it would mean to live like this. Could he keep pretending? Could he really continue playing a role for the rest of his life? He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. I get it, Eleanor, he said, forcing himself to sound confident. I know what I signed up for. She nodded once, her eyes searching his face, as if to make sure he meant it. Then, she turned away, walking back to her desk. Good, she said, her tone shifting back to its usual cold, detached manner. Then we can move forward. You continue playing the role of my husband, and I'll continue doing what I do best. Mark stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of the conversation settle in. He knew Eleanor wasn't asking for anything more than what they had agreed on, but in that brief moment of honesty, he had caught a glimpse of something he hadn't seen before: vulnerability, perhaps, or loneliness. For the first time, he wondered if he was the only one trapped in this charade. As he walked out of the office, he couldn't help but feel a nagging question rise in his mind: was he really willing to keep living this way? Or was it time to finally confront what he was becoming? End of part 5. Mark couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in his chest after his conversation with Eleanor. For days, he had pushed his growing doubts aside, focusing on the roles they played in public.
He had been doing what they agreed upon, staying by her side at every gala, every business meeting, smiling for the cameras, and playing the perfect husband. But now, the cracks in the facade were starting to show. He had started questioning everything: his life, his choices, and his future in this grand house that felt more like a gilded cage than a home. The following week, Eleanor had invited him to a high-profile charity event at one of the city's most luxurious venues. It was a glamorous affair, filled with New York's elite investors, socialites, and business tycoons all mingling under glittering chandeliers. Mark, in his perfectly tailored suit, stood beside Eleanor, his hand lightly resting on her waist, a public gesture of the partnership they had agreed upon. Yet, in the crowd of people laughing, talking, and exchanging business cards, Mark felt more isolated than ever. As the evening wore on, Eleanor was surrounded by people, each one vying for a piece of her attention. Mark, however, found himself alone, standing by a window, gazing out at the city below. The view was breathtaking: skyscrapers lit up like stars in the night sky, but Mark didn't feel the awe he thought he would. He felt disconnected. He thought about his life before all of this: the small apartment, the struggle to pay bills, the constant worry. At least back then, he had his freedom. Now he was living in someone else's world, playing a part he wasn't sure he was cut out for. As he stared into the distance, lost in his thoughts, a voice interrupted him. You look a little out of place, don't you think? Mark turned, startled. It was Claire, one of Eleanor's closest associates, a woman who had worked with Eleanor for years. She was tall, elegant, and always impeccably dressed. Her sharp eyes assessed him with an almost amused expression. Claire tilted her head slightly, scrutinizing him. You know, I've seen a lot of men like you at these events. Wealthy, powerful men who get everything they want. And then there are the ones like you. She paused, her eyes narrowing just slightly. The ones who don't belong here but are trying to fit in. Mark's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. I'm just here for the company, he said, trying to sound casual. But something in his voice gave away the uncertainty he had been feeling.
Claire didn't respond immediately, but there was a knowing look in her eyes that made Mark uncomfortable. Before he could say anything else, Eleanor appeared beside them, her smile flawless and her composure unwavering. Mark, darling, there you are, she said, her voice smooth and confident. She placed a hand on his arm, her eyes shifting to Claire. Is everything all right? Just a little chat, Claire said, her tone light, but her gaze still lingering on Mark. I was just telling Mark how lucky he is to be here. Eleanor's smile tightened slightly, and she placed a possessive hand on Mark's arm. Yes, he's very lucky indeed. But tonight is about the charity, not about idle gossip. Her voice was cool, almost dismissive, and Claire didn't press further. Eleanor guided Mark away from the window and toward the center of the room, where a large stage had been set up for speeches and announcements. As they walked through the crowd, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor was more than just protective. She was possessive, controlling, even. He had felt it in her words, in her gestures. She didn't just want him as her husband for appearances. She wanted him to be everything she needed him to be, and nothing more. And the more he saw of it, the more he wondered how much of himself he could afford to lose in the process. When the event finally came to a close, Mark and Eleanor left the venue together, but Mark felt no relief. The car ride back to the estate was silent, Eleanor's gaze fixed out the window, her thoughts seemingly miles away. Mark sat next to her, his mind racing with questions he hadn't been able to answer. What was he doing? What had he really signed up for? As they reached the gates of the estate, Mark turned to Eleanor, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor, is this really what you wanted? Is this the life you wanted me to live? She didn't immediately answer. She simply turned to him, her expression unreadable, before speaking in her usual calm, controlled tone. This is the life we both chose, Mark. You knew what you were getting into. Now, you need to understand that this is the life we will lead. Together. Her words were final, but Mark couldn't ignore the flicker of something deeper behind them. Was it doubt? Regret? Or just the weight of everything she had built?
Mark felt the weight of the moment settle on him as the car pulled up to the front of the mansion. He was trapped in a world that didn't feel like his own. And no matter how much he pretended, no matter how much he played the role, he couldn't escape the feeling that something was slowly slipping away. End of part 6. The morning after the charity event began quietly, but there was tension in the air that Mark couldn't ignore. He sat alone in the grand kitchen, sipping his coffee, listening to the echo of footsteps in the distant hallways. The mansion felt emptier than usual, almost hollow, as if even the walls could sense something was about to change. He hadn't seen Eleanor since the night before. When they returned home, she had gone straight to her study and closed the door, leaving him standing in the hall, uncertain and restless. Now, as he stared into his cup, he wondered if he had finally crossed a line he couldn't return from. Hours later, his phone buzzed with a message from Eleanor's assistant. Board meeting. Noon. Attendance required. Mark frowned. Eleanor had never asked him to attend a board meeting before. Something about it felt off. Still, he had no choice but to comply. By the time he arrived at Brooks Enterprises, the air in the building was electric with tension. Employees whispered in corners, glancing nervously toward the glass-walled boardroom. When Mark entered, every conversation stopped. He could feel the stares, sharp and assessing. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, her expression composed but cold. Beside her, a man in a gray Suida senior board member stood holding a folder. He looked at Mark with a smug smile. Mr. Davis, the man said smoothly, so glad you could join us. It seems your presence has become quite relevant. Mark frowned, looking between him and Eleanor. What is going on? He asked. The man's smile widened. There have been concerns raised about your background, he said, drawing out the words. The board feels it is important to verify that Mrs. Brooks's new husband isn't, shall we say, taking advantage of his position. Murmurs spread across the room. Eleanor's jaw tightened, her hand gripping the edge of the table. Mark could see the flicker of anger in her eyes, though her voice remained steady. "This is inappropriate," Eleanor said sharply.
My husband's private life is not subject to this board's approval. But the man in gray only shrugged. When that private life affects company reputation, Mrs. Brooks, it becomes very much our concern. He turned to Mark. Tell me, Mr. Davis, how does a struggling law student with no notable achievements end up married to one of the most powerful women in the state? The words cut deep. Mark felt his pulse rise, his face flushing with humiliation. He glanced at Eleanor, but she remained silent, her expression unreadable. The silence felt like betrayal. Finally, Mark spoke, his voice steady but firm. Whatever you think you know about me, you are wrong. I am not here for her money. I am here because we made an agreement, one that benefits us both. The room erupted in whispers, but Eleanor's glare silenced them instantly. She stood, her voice sharp and commanding. That is enough, she said. This meeting is over. The man in gray opened his mouth to protest, but one look from her shut him down. If anyone here wishes to question my judgment again, they can clear out their desks by the end of the day. Her authority was absolute, and no one dared challenge her. But even as the room fell silent, the damage was done. As they left the boardroom, Eleanor walked briskly ahead, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Mark followed, his chest tight. When they reached the elevator, she turned to him, her eyes blazing. Do you see what you have done? She hissed. They are questioning everything now. My decisions, my credibility because of you. Mark's stomach twisted. I didn't ask to be dragged into that meeting, he said quietly. I have done everything you asked me to. Eleanor shook her head, her voice cold. Maybe that is the problem, Mark. You are doing everything I ask but nothing more. The elevator doors closed, and for the first time since their marriage, Mark saw something in her expression that unsettled him deeply. Not anger. Not control. But fear. End of part 7. The days following the board meeting were tense. Eleanor had become even more distant, retreating into her work and avoiding any meaningful conversation with Mark. He understood why. She was a woman who thrived on control, and this challenge to her authority had shaken her. But it had also left Mark with a growing sense of unease.
The tension between them had always been there, but now it felt suffocating, like they were walking on a tightrope, unsure of which way it would snap. Mark spent his days lost in his thoughts, his mind racing with doubts and fears. The lavish mansion, once a symbol of escape and comfort, now felt more like a gilded cage. He was constantly reminded of how little he truly belonged here. Eleanor's world was too big, too far removed from everything he knew. And the more he tried to fit in, the more he realized that this marriage was becoming a prison of his own making. One evening, as Mark sat in the library of the estate, scrolling through old legal papers, a soft knock at the door startled him. He looked up to see Eleanor standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "May I come in?" she asked, her tone polite but distant. Mark nodded, setting aside the papers. Eleanor stepped inside and closed the door behind her, walking over to the window and gazing out at the sprawling grounds. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick, filled with unspoken words and unresolved tension. Finally, Eleanor turned to face him, her eyes softer now, but still guarded. "I wanted to apologize," she said, her voice low, "for how things have been lately. I've been preoccupied." She hesitated, as if trying to find the right words. "I didn't expect things to get this complicated, Mark." Mark looked at her, surprised by the sudden shift in her tone. "Complicated? Eleanor, this was always complicated." His voice was tinged with frustration. "But what do you mean by complicated?" Eleanor sighed, walking closer to him. "I mean that this marriage was supposed to be a way out for both of us. A solution. But it hasn't been that. Not for me, Not for you. She paused, her gaze falling to the floor. I pushed you into this, Mark. I asked you to pretend to be someone you're not. And now, I see the toll it's taking on you. Mark shook his head, his mind racing. He had never expected Eleanor to acknowledge the strain, the emotional cost. It's not just me, Eleanor. This whole arrangement, it's falling apart. We're falling apart. For a long moment, Eleanor said nothing. Her eyes flickered with a mixture of emotions, but she quickly masked them, as if afraid to let them show. Maybe, she whispered, almost to herself.
Maybe it's time we both faced the truth. The words hung in the air, heavy and unresolved. Mark couldn't decide whether to push further or to let it go. He didn't know if he was ready to confront the reality of their situation. But deep down, he knew they couldn't continue this way. They couldn't keep pretending. Eleanor stepped closer, her voice softening. I need to know that you're in this for more than just the money, Mark. I need to know that you're really here with me, not just playing a role. Mark stared at her, searching her eyes, looking for something he wasn't sure he would ever find. He had been living in this illusion for so long, not questioning it, not questioning her. But now, as he stood there, faced with the truth of their situation, he realized how much he had lost, how much he had allowed himself to be swallowed by this charade. Then perhaps it's time we make a decision, Mark, she said, her voice cold. A final one. She turned to leave the room but paused at the door, her back to him. I hope you're ready for it. Mark stood there for a long moment, the weight of her words sinking in. It wasn't just about the marriage anymore. It wasn't just about the money, the status, or the role he had been playing. It was about who he had become and who he wanted to be. The decision ahead of him was clear, but it felt like he was standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure of whether he could take the leap. End of Part 8. The days following Eleanor's ultimatum were a blur for Mark. His mind was clouded with doubt, but deep down, he knew he couldn't keep living this way. He had agreed to the marriage out of necessity, to save his family, to escape the suffocating weight of debt, but somewhere along the way, he had lost himself. The mansion, the luxury, the status, it all felt hollow now. And as much as he wanted to blame Eleanor, he couldn't. She had been honest with him from the start, and it was he who had allowed himself to be swept up in the illusion. The final push came one evening, a week after their tense conversation in the library. Mark had spent the afternoon alone in the estate's garden, walking through the rows of manicured flowers, trying to clear his head. When he returned to the house, he found Eleanor waiting for him in the living room, her expression unreadable, as always.
This time, however, there was a different energy in the air, something less controlled, less distant. Mark, we need to talk, she said, her voice soft but firm. She motioned for him to sit. The silence between them felt heavier than it had before, and Mark hesitated for a moment before taking a seat on the couch opposite her. Eleanor didn't waste time. I've been thinking, she started, her eyes meeting his. We can't keep doing this. Not like this. Mark's heart skipped a beat. For the first time in weeks, he saw a crack in Eleanor's armor. What do you mean? He asked, his voice steady but unsure. Eleanor took a deep breath, her gaze shifting to the floor for a moment before returning to his. We've both been pretending. I'm not blind, Mark. I see how this is affecting you. It's not fair to either of us. You never signed up for this life, not really. And I don't think I can keep asking you to play a role I never should have put you in. Mark sat in stunned silence. He had always believed that it was his own discontent, his own struggle with the situation that was the problem. But hearing Eleanor admit it had, they were both trapped in a lie opened, a floodgate of emotions he hadn't expected. Then what do we do? He asked quietly. Eleanor's expression softened, but there was still a coldness to it, a certain resignation. We let go, she said simply. It's time we stop pretending. We both need to live our own lives, Mark. You deserve more than this, more than a contract. And I need to face the truth about what I've been doing. Mark felt a wave of relief rush over him, mixed with an unfamiliar sadness. For the first time since this all began, he felt like he could breathe. He had been holding on to something that wasn't real, and now, finally, he was being given the freedom to let it go. But even as he accepted the truth of her words, A part of him couldn't help but wonder about what could have been. He had seen glimpses of something more between them, something deeper, but it was buried beneath the weight of their arrangement. Now, it seemed that both of them had to move on separate ways, without looking back. "I never wanted this to end like this," Mark said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I don't think we can go back to what we were before. And maybe that's okay." Eleanor nodded slowly, her lips pressing into a tight line.
"It's more than okay, Mark. It's the only way forward." She stood up and walked toward the door, her hand resting on the handle. "You're free now. We both are." Mark watched her go, the weight of her words settling heavily in his chest. For the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't feel trapped. He didn't feel like he was playing a role anymore. He was just Mark Devise, a man who had lived through a lie but was now free to rewrite his own story. Eleanor had given him the freedom to walk away, to reclaim the life he had lost. And as much as it hurt, he knew it was the right thing to do. As he walked out of the mansion later that night, Mark couldn't help but look back one last time. He knew the life he had walked away from wasn't his. But what lay ahead, the future he would build for himself, was. And for the first time in a long time, Mark was ready to face it. Alone, but free. End of Part 9.